Welcome to Bible Story Time for Kids. Hi there, little ones and parents. We're so excited to have you here at Bible Story Time for Kids, where the amazing stories of the Bible come to life just for you. Each story is not only exciting, but also filled with important lessons about faith, kindness, and love. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, so you'll never miss out on the next exciting adventure. Have you ever heard the story of a man who parted the sea and led thousands of people to freedom? Well, that's the incredible story of Moses. Today, we're going to dive into the life of one of the most important leaders in the Bible, whose journey was filled with miracles, challenges, and the power of faith. Moses lived a long time ago in Egypt, where the Israelites, his people, were slaves to a mighty and unkind king known as Pharaoh. Pharaoh was afraid that the Israelites would become too strong, so he made their lives very difficult. But even though Moses was born during this tough time, God had a very special plan for him. Throughout this video, we'll explore how Moses' life unfolded, from being rescued as a baby to growing up in Pharaoh's palace and eventually becoming the one chosen by God to free the Israelites. You'll hear about incredible moments like the parting of the Red Sea and when God gave Moses the 10 Commandments. So, are you ready to hear the story of Moses, the man who trusted in God and changed the course of history? Let's get started with the story of his birth. The birth of Moses. A long time ago in Egypt, there was a terrible law. The Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, was afraid that the Israelites, who were his slaves, would grow too strong in number. Though he made a cruel decision, every baby boy born to the Israelites had to be thrown into the Nile River. It was a very scary time for all the families, especially those expecting a baby. One day, a special baby boy was born to an Israelite family. His mother, Jochebed, loved him very much and couldn't bear the thought of losing him. She hid him in their house for 3 months to protect him from Pharaoh's soldiers. But as the baby grew, it became harder to keep him a secret. Jochebed came up with a brave plan. She made a basket out of reeds and waterproofed it with tar. Then, with a prayer in her heart, she placed her baby boy inside the basket and gently set it in the Nile River, hoping that God would protect him. The baby's sister Miriam watched closely as the basket floated down the river. Suddenly, the basket was found by none other than Pharaoh's daughter. When she opened it, she saw the baby crying and felt sorry for him. Even though she knew he was an Israelite baby, she decided to take him in and raise him as her own. Miriam, who had been watching from nearby, bravely approached Pharaoh's daughter and asked, "Shall I go and find one of the Israelite women to nurse the baby for you?" Pharaoh's daughter agreed, and Miriam rushed to get her mother. In an amazing twist, Jochebed was able to take care of her own son while he grew, before he went to live with Pharaoh's family in the palace. Pharaoh's daughter named the baby Moses, which means drawn out of water. Moses was saved from danger and grew up in the royal palace, but God had an even greater plan for his life. This little baby would grow up to do something truly amazing. Moses' early life and identity. Moses grew up as a prince in Pharaoh's palace, surrounded by luxury and wealth. From the outside, it seemed like he had everything a young boy could ever want. He was raised as an Egyptian, living in the grandest house in all of Egypt, with servants to tend to his needs, finest food, and the best education. He learned about Egyptian gods, how to read and write, and was trained in the ways of Egyptian royalty. Pharaoh treated Moses like his own grandson, and Moses was given every opportunity that a young prince could have. Deep inside, Moses was different. Even though he was raised as an Egyptian, he knew that he was an Israelite. He had learned from his mother, Jochebed, about the God of his people, the one true God who had promised to take care of the Israelite. Moses' heart was connected to his true identity, even though he wore the clothes of a prince. As Moses grew older, he started to notice the suffering of his people, the Israelites, who were slaves to the Egyptians. He would see them building massive structures under the hot sun, whipped by the taskmasters when they didn't work fast enough. They were treated with cruelty, and their lives were full of hardship. Every day, Moses' heart grew heavier as he saw the suffering around him. How could he, an Israelite by birth, live in a palace while his own people were being treated so harshly? One day, when Moses was about 40 years old, something happened that would change his life forever. He went out to where the Israelites were working and saw an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave. The sight made Moses angry. Without thinking, Moses stepped in to defend the Israelite. He looked around to make sure no one was watching, and then he struck the Egyptian, killing him. Moses was shocked at what he had done. He had meant to stop the cruelty, but now he had killed a man. Panicking, Moses quickly buried the Egyptian in the sand, hoping no one would find out. The next day, Moses returned to the same place. This time, he saw two Israelites fighting with each other. Moses tried to step in and break up the fight, saying, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" But one of the men turned to Moses and said, "Who made you a ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moses' heart sank. People knew what he had done. It was no longer a secret. He realized that word of the incident would soon reach Pharaoh, and he would be in great danger. Sure enough, Pharaoh heard about what had happened and sought to have Moses killed. Moses had no choice but to run for his life. He fled Egypt and made his way to a distant land called Midian, far away from the reach of Pharaoh's soldiers. For Moses, this was not only a physical journey, but a journey of the heart. He left behind the only home he had ever known, a life of royalty and the future he had once imagined for himself. When Moses arrived in Midian, he found himself in a very different world. Instead of palaces and servants, Moses now lived as a shepherd in the desert. He met a man named Jethro, a priest of Midian, who welcomed Moses into his family. Moses even married one of Jethro's daughters, named Zipporah, and together they started a new life. For many years, Moses worked as a shepherd, quietly tending to his flocks in the wilderness. But although Moses had settled into a new life in Midian, he could never forget his people, the Israelites, who were still suffering in Egypt. Memories of their pain and hardship stayed with him. And even though he was far from Egypt, God was preparing Moses for a new mission, one that would change his life and the lives of the Israelites forever. Moses flees to Midian. After Moses fled from Egypt, he traveled a long way, leaving behind everything he had ever known. He crossed deserts and mountains, eventually arriving in the land of Midian. This land was very different from the grand palaces of Egypt. Instead of the hustle and bustle of city life, Midian was quiet and peaceful, with wide open spaces and rolling hills. Moses felt like a stranger in a foreign land, but he had no choice. He could never return to Egypt, as Pharaoh now wanted him dead. One day, Moses came to a well in Midian, where he sat down to rest. As he sat there, a group of shepherds arrived with their flocks of sheep. Among them were 7 sisters, the daughters of a man named Jethro, who was a respected priest in Midian. The sisters had come to the well to draw water for their sheep, but when they tried, some other shepherds arrived and began pushing them away. Seeing this, Moses stood up and came to their defense. He chased away the rude shepherds and helped the sisters draw water for their flock. The sisters were so grateful that they rushed home to tell their father about the kind stranger who had helped them. When Jethro heard the story, he invited Moses to his home. He welcomed Moses into his family, and before long, Moses became a part of Jethro's household. In time, Moses married one of Jethro's daughters, a kind and caring woman named Zipporah. Together, they had a son named Gershom, whose name means a foreigner there, reflecting how Moses felt as an outsider in this new land. Moses began his new life as a shepherd, taking care of Jethro's flocks in the wilderness. Every day he led the sheep through the hills and valleys, far from the busy life he had once known in Egypt. It seemed like Moses had found a quiet life, far removed from the troubles of his past. But even though Moses was in Midian, God had not forgotten about him. God had a big plan for Moses, a plan that would take him back to Egypt, not as a prince, but as a leader who would set his people free. Burning bush and God's call. Many years passed while Moses lived in Midian, tending sheep and leading a quiet life. But one day, something extraordinary happened that would change everything. Moses was out in the wilderness, guiding his flock near a mountain called Horeb, also known as the Mountain of God. As he walked, something caught his eye. A bush that was on fire. Now, seeing a bush on fire in the desert wasn't unusual, but this bush was different. Although it was blazing with flames, the bush wasn't burning up. The leaves and branches stayed intact, and the fire didn't consume it. Curious, Moses decided to take a closer look. As he approached the burning bush, something even more incredible happened. A voice called out from the flames, saying, "Moses, Moses." Moses was startled and replied, "Here I am." The voice spoke again, "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Moses obeyed, taking off his sandals and bowing low in respect. Then the voice said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Hearing this, Moses was filled with awe and fear. Covered his face, for he knew he was in the presence of God. God spoke to Moses again, telling him something that must have been surprising and overwhelming. "I have seen the suffering of my people, the Israelites, who are being treated harshly in Egypt. I have heard their cries, and I am concerned about their misery. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey." Moses must have felt relieved to hear that God was going to rescue his people. But then God said something even more surprising. "Now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Moses couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" Moses was just a simple shepherd now. How could he stand up to the mighty Pharaoh, the king of Egypt? God reassured Moses, saying, "I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." Still unsure, Moses asked, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" God replied, "I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites, 'I am has sent me to you.'" God gave Moses more instructions and told him that he would perform miracles to show Pharaoh his power. Even though Moses was afraid, God promised that he would be with him every step of the way. So, with God's reassurance, Moses agreed to take on the mission. He would return to Egypt, not as a prince or a shepherd, but as a leader chosen by God to free the Israelites. Moses and Pharaoh. After God spoke to Moses through the burning bush, Moses knew what he had to do. Even though he was nervous and unsure, he trusted in God's promise that he would be with him. So Moses left his life in Midian, took his wife and children, and made the long journey back to Egypt, where he would confront Pharaoh, the powerful king who ruled over the land. When Moses arrived in Egypt, he went straight to Pharaoh's palace. Pharaoh was not the same ruler who had raised Moses as a prince, but he was just as cruel and stubborn as the last one. The Egyptians were still using the Israelites as slaves, forcing them to work long hours in the hot sun, making bricks and building great structures for Pharaoh's kingdom. Moses stood before Pharaoh and delivered the message God had given him. "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." Pharaoh looked at Moses with disbelief. Who was this former prince, now just a simple shepherd, to demand such a thing? Pharaoh refused and said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Moses warned Pharaoh that God would show his power if Pharaoh didn't listen. Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he refused to let the Israelites go. So, God began to send a series of plagues upon Egypt, each one more terrible than the last. First plague came when Moses struck the Nile River with his staff, and the waters turned to blood. Fish died, the water became undrinkable, and the people had nothing to drink. But even this did not change Pharaoh's mind. Next, God sent a plague of frogs. Frogs came out of the river and covered the entire land, jumping into houses, kitchens, and even Pharaoh's palace. Pharaoh was so bothered by the frogs that he asked Moses to pray to God to remove them. Pharaoh promised that he would let the Israelites go if the frogs were gone. But when God made the frogs disappear, Pharaoh changed his mind and refused to free Israelites. Then came a plague of gnats. Tiny insects filled the air, bothering people and animals alike. After that, God sent a plague of flies. Flies swarmed everywhere in Egypt, except in the part of the land where the Israelites lived, showing that God was protecting his people. Still, Pharaoh would not let the Israelites go. Plagues continued. God sent a disease that killed the Egyptians' livestock, cows, horses, and sheep, but none of the Israelites' animals were harmed. Then, painful boils broke out on the skin of the Egyptians. Pharaoh's heart remained hard. Next, a hailstorm so fierce that it destroyed crops and homes swept across the land. Pharaoh begged Moses to stop the storm, but as soon as the hail stopped, he again refused to let the Israelites go. After that came a swarm of locusts, which ate every plant and crop that remained after the hail. Then, a thick darkness covered the land of Egypt for 3 days. No one could see or move, except the Israelites, who had light where they lived. Yet still, Pharaoh refused to let them go. Finally, God told Moses that one last plague would come, one that would finally force Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. This would be the most terrible plague of all, the death of the firstborn. Every firstborn son in Egypt would die, from the sons of Pharaoh to the poorest families, unless Pharaoh obeyed God's command. Before the plague came, Moses instructed the Israelites to mark their doorposts with the blood of a lamb so that God would pass over their houses and spare their firstborn children. This became known as the Passover. When the plague struck, it was devastating. Pharaoh's own son died, and the cries of grief could be heard all over Egypt. Pharaoh, broken and defeated, finally told Moses, "Go, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go and worship the Lord as you have requested." At last, Pharaoh let the Israelites go. But the journey was just beginning, and more challenges awaited Moses and his people. The Exodus and parting of the Red Sea, with Pharaoh's final command, Moses and the Israelites were free at last. After years of slavery and suffering, they could finally leave Egypt and journey to the land that God had promised them. The news spread quickly through the Israelite community, and the people began packing their belongings, gathering their families, and preparing for the long journey ahead. There were thousands of Israelites, men, women, children, and even their animals. They hurried out of Egypt as quickly as they could, excited but also a little nervous. Would Pharaoh change his mind again? Would the Egyptians try to stop them? But they trusted in God, and they trusted in Moses to lead them. God guided them every step of the way. During the day, God appeared as a pillar of cloud, leading the Israelites through the desert. At night, he appeared as a pillar of fire, lighting their way. With God leading them, they felt safe, knowing that he was watching over them. But back in Egypt, Pharaoh's heart hardened once more. Even though he had let the Israelites go, he soon regretted his decision. He realized that with the Israelites gone, Egypt had lost its workforce. Who would build their cities and do all the hard labor? Pharaoh's anger returned, and he gathered his army of soldiers and chariots to chase after the Israelites. He was determined to bring them back. Meanwhile, the Israelites had traveled far, but soon found themselves in a difficult situation. They had reached the shores of the Red Sea, a vast body of water that stretched out before them. With no boats to cross, they were stuck. And to make matters worse, when they looked behind them, they saw Pharaoh's army approaching in the distance, kicking up dust as they came closer and closer. The people began to panic. "What are we going to do?" they cried to Moses. "Were there no graves in Egypt that you brought us out here to die in the desert?" Moses, however, remained calm. He trusted in God's plan. "Do not be afraid," he told the people. "Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Then God spoke to Moses and gave him a command. "Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water, so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground." Moses obeyed. He raised his staff, and an amazing thing happened. The wind began to blow, and the waters of the Red Sea parted. On either side of them, the water rose up like walls, leaving a path of dry land in the middle. It was a miracle. God had made a way where there was no way. The Israelites began to cross the sea on dry ground, hurrying as fast as they could. Behind them, Pharaoh's army was still approaching, but God was watching over his people. To slow Pharaoh's army down, God caused their chariots to get stuck in the mud, making it hard for them to move quickly. Once all the Israelites had safely crossed to the other side, God gave Moses one final instruction. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea again, and the waters rushed back to their place, covering Pharaoh's army. The Egyptians who had chased the Israelites into the sea were swept away. and the people of Israel were finally free from the Egyptians for good. The Israelites stood on the far shore, looking out at the sea that had just saved their lives. They were filled with amazement and gratitude. They knew that God had done something incredible for them, and they celebrated with songs and dancing, thanking God for his protection and power. Moses' sister, Miriam, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women followed her with tambourines, dancing and singing a song of praise. Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea. It was a joyful time for the Israelites. They had seen God's mighty power, and they knew he was leading them to the promised land. But their journey was not over yet. The road ahead would be long, and there were still challenges to come. But for now, they celebrated the freedom that God had given them through Moses, their leader. The 10 Commandments. After the incredible miracle of crossing the Red Sea, Moses continued to lead the Israelites through the wilderness. God was guiding them every step of the way, providing food and water for them even in the desert. The journey was long and difficult, but Moses kept reminding the people to trust in God's plan. One day, they reached a mountain called Mount Sinai. It was here that God had something very important to tell Moses and the Israelites. God called Moses to come up to the top of the mountain, where he would give him a special set of rules for the people to follow. These rules were called the 10 Commandments, and they were meant to help the Israelites live in a way that would honor God and show love and respect to each other. As Moses climbed the mountain, a thick cloud covered the top, and the mountain trembled with thunder and lightning. People stayed below, watching in awe as Moses went up to meet with God. It was a moment they would never forget. When Moses reached the top, God spoke to him and gave him the 10 Commandments, which were written on stone tablets. These commandments were, "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. You shall not covet." These commandments were more than just rules. They were a guide for how the Israelites should live their lives. God wanted them to be kind, honest, and faithful to him. Moses knew that these commandments were a gift from God, meant to help the people live in peace and harmony with each other. When Moses came down from the mountain carrying the stone tablets, people listened carefully as he shared the commandments with them. From that day on, 10 Commandments became the foundation, how the Israelites would live as God's chosen people. Moses' legacy. Moses spent the rest of his life leading the Israelites through the wilderness on their journey to the Promised Land. Even though the path was difficult and the people often complained, Moses remained faithful to God's plan. He continued to guide the Israelites, teaching them the laws and commandments that God had given him and reminding them to trust in God's promises. As the years passed, Moses became known as a great leader and prophet. He was the one who had spoken directly to God, who had led the people out of slavery in Egypt, and who had shown them God's incredible power through miracles. Moses had been there to part the Red Sea, to receive the 10 Commandments, and to lead the people through many trials and challenges. But even though Moses had led the people for many years, God had told him that he would not enter the Promised Land himself. Instead, Moses' role was to bring the Israelites to the edge of the land and then pass the leadership to someone else. The person chosen to lead the Israelites after Moses was Joshua, a strong and faithful servant of God. Before Moses died, he gave one final message to the Israelites. He reminded them of everything God had done for them and encouraged them to remain faithful. He told them to follow God's laws and to love and obey him with all their hearts. Moses wanted the people to remember that their success and happiness depended on their relationship with God. Moses then climbed a mountain called Mount Nebo, where God showed him the land that the Israelites would soon enter, promised land flowing with milk and honey, just as God had promised. Moses could see the land, but he knew his journey had come to an end. He died there on the mountain, and the Bible says that God himself buried Moses. Even though Moses did not enter the Promised Land, his legacy lived on. He was remembered as one of the greatest leaders in the Bible, a man of faith, courage, and obedience to God. Moses' story continues to inspire people even today, reminding us of the power of trusting in God's plan, no matter how difficult the journey may seem.